Yeah.
Doesn't make me laugh. I got for something.
Yeah.
The fact that at least you read the email, but this is the conversation much easier. Hold on.
So I'm.
I'm good, how are you? Busy.
So I know, we'll just go ahead and get started. So thank you all very much to coming to our, I'm gonna assume it's our last P30 seminar for the year, but I could be wrong. And today, 2 more, okay, yeah, see, I'm wrong. Oh, year ended doesn't mean we did. So I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for today. His name is Adam Mahoney, who is a climate and environment reporter at Capital B, which is a Black-led news organization reporting across the country. First met Adam a couple years ago through Zoom. He was working in for a story on oil impacts in the LA area, which is where I just happened to be at the time. And so we're very pleased to have him speak today and share his grand knowledge of what it is to actually be a journalist reporter reporting on environmental justice. So I will share the screen now.
Yeah, do you think this is thing and see what oh shit. Okay. Thank you. Perfect. All right. Thank you for inviting me, Yoshi, and for all the help that you gave me with that project about my hometown. Before we get started, I just want to say, please don't judge my PowerPoint skills. I'm very proud of been too many years. But today I'll be talking a bit about the environmental justice beat and how I approach it and trying to expand it with some of the different intersections that I've been able to come across in my work over the last couple of years. I wanted to start showing this photo that my colleague took in Jackson, Mississippi last year during one of their many drinking water boil notices. I think this one was in September of last year. But I wanted to show this photo because I think it highlights, a growing reality in the face of environmental justice and the fact that, community members are going to be the ones that we take care of each other, and we saw it in Jackson, and we've seen it in communities across the country facing issues providing pollution, access to clean and affordable drinking water, and things like that. And I think too often in environmental reporting we kind of take a top-down approach where we focus on federal solutions. The billions of dollars that are being made available, but really communities tend to take longer to actually feel the impact of federal level solutions as well as seeing it on an everyday basis. So yeah, and we've also seen actually in Jackson in a way that the federal government does not make these connections. So in Jackson, we've seen folks connect their lack of access to clean and affordable water to education outcomes, to lead poisoning, to disruptions in communal relationships, familial relationships, and even community violence in terms of we've obviously done studies that show how water pollution, how lead poisoning affects cognitive ability, decision making, mood, and anger, and things like that. And folks on the ground see that every day in a way that is not necessarily supported at the federal level. There we go. Yeah, so I wanted to start with how I got here, because when I interview folks, the first question I tend to ask is, what is the moment that brought you into the movement, right? Because I think in justice spaces, and particularly in environmental justice, it's a very daunting and sometimes traumatizing field. So to have that in the back of your head, you know, the moment that inspired you to get into the work and to continue to push you forward is really important. And as we know, like things don't happen by coincidence or chance, especially in this country and the way that, you know, systemic racism shapes our like outcomes. So I thought it would make sense for me to start with what brought me into environmental justice reporting, which is a little rare in the field, directly impacted a person in terms of environmental injustices. And it started before I was born, right? So my father was born in Beaumont, Texas, which is the birthplace of the US global oil industry. From the early 1900s to World War II, more oil was produced in Beaumont than anywhere else in the world. And in the 1920s, in part because of that, they were drawn by the opportunity in terms of jobs at oil fields, at the oil refineries there. And by the 1950s, my great-grandfather was finally able to get employed at the mobile oil refinery in Beaumont, which changed my life trajectory before I was even born, right? It introduced my family to the middle class. It offered us stability. And at the same time, as we know, folks that are living in proximity to oil infrastructure, it dictated the health outcomes of my family there. So when my great-grandfather retired, you know, less than a couple months after that, he had a stroke and passed away not too long after. And there have been studies that have shown the increase in strokes in communities that are overburdened by pollution. But around the 1960s, my family moved west to Los Angeles, the height of the Great Migration, and my folks landed in Gardena, which is a suburb of LA, which is also overburdened by industrial infrastructure. In the 1990s, my parents and my older brother found themselves in the Watts-Glenwood area of California, which is right outside of LA. As you probably heard of the, Watts riots in 1965, the LA uprising in 1992. That was the epicenter. It was actually being a Rodney King was a week before my brother's first birthday. And for the month that followed, my family was basically trapped inside of their homes, police occupation of their community after the riots. And it was at that moment that my parents thought it would be a good idea to move south of Watts to the harbor area of Los Angeles, which is known as the fossil fuels capital of the West Coast. So I grew up half a mile away from an oil refinery, 100 feet from an oil well, and on top of the third largest oil field in the continental United States, and about a mile away from the port of LA, which is the highest polluting port in North America. So I grew up with all the things that you would associate that with, asthma, I was in preterm birth. So in a way, the police beating a Black man years before I was born led to me growing up in an environmental justice community. And I think, I highlight that point because it shows the sense of nature of what environmental justice can be, right? And I think a lot of people are making those connections now, whether that be, in Atlanta with the fight over Cop City, the building of a police training facility in the middle of a forest. There's just the different ways that violence manifests and intersect with each other. But also wanted to include some other places that I like to call home. So folks there probably would say they're my home. But for 3 months in 2018, I worked on a research project in Jinja, Uganda, or in a semi-rural town outside of Jinja, researching the ways that a lack of a traditional waste collection system there dictated the way that people interacted with each other. And then I spent 6 weeks in Dalat, Vietnam, which is in central Vietnam in 2019, working on a research project on the ways that colonialism, particularly the US occupation of Vietnam, continues to dictate their food map now, whether that be, the remnants of Ancient Orange and the decimation of farmland and forests and things like that, but also now Vietnam is one of the largest exporters of different grains and vegetables to Western countries, which is the direct result of that war. And lastly, I spent 6 years living in Chicago, where I started my career as a criminal justice reporter, reporting on police and prisons, which once again has been kind of invaluable in the way that I look at environmental justice. Yeah. Okay, to start in the doom and gloom, because that is my job, I wanted to talk a little bit about the ways that the traditional journalism industry has failed the EJ movement. And starting on the left, we have a recent survey that came from the Pew Research Center that was released last month that broke down the largest reporting beats in the United States by gender, age, and race. And as you can see, environment and energy is the oldest beat in terms of who comprises the beat and the widest beat. And we know that that is just a bit ironic given who the environmental and not really climate crisis impacts the most, that being young folks and people of color. And then on the right, I just wanted to highlight a couple of different ways that that has looked like over the last couple of decades. And little ironic, and I am not an academic institution, but the first one is an over-reliance on academic studies. And I think, you know, as someone who has a lived experience of environmental justice, I know the value of academic studies and showing and highlighting the ways that people are living through these inequities, but the industry got a little lazy in the fact that we tend to uplift those studies rather than the experiences of folks. And while both are really important to mitigating the crisis, too often if we put that emphasis on academic studies, particularly the millions of dollars that are funneled into these projects, rather than into the communities directly impacted by these issues, in a way can prolong the crisis. And we've seen that, or I've seen that particularly in Wilmington, where I grew up. Over my time there, there was 3 or 4 federal studies that took place. Environmental groups got tens of thousands of dollars of grants to do surveying, but we're still living next to oil refineries. We're still living next to oil wells, and that hasn't changed. And then secondly, what is this? Uplifting the loudest voices. So thankfully in the environmental justice movement, we do have legacy groups, right? We have great folks like in New York, we have in California, we have Communities for a Better Environment who have done amazing things in this space. But as the movement has gotten a little more grassroots, we've seen some division in terms of like what communities want to see. And when you harp on the loudest voices, when you harp on the folks who have been in the game the longest, it tends to erase younger generations. It tends to erase the most marginalized, immigrant populations, low-income folks. And we do that in extension to just environmental groups, but as well as with the federal government, like I mentioned earlier. So for example, I'm working on a story now about the water crisis in the southern United States, and the way that it manifests differently in each community. And as folks know, over the last year and a half, the federal government has offered more money to solve the water crisis than ever before, billions of dollars. But at the same time, they're offering blanket solutions that are focused on replacing lead pipes, improving water plants, which are very important. But in some communities, that's not going to solve the crisis, right? So when you think about Louisiana, we have hundreds of chemical plants dumping pollutants into the waterways. What is replacing lead pipes going to do? So each community deserves specific solutions that tend to get neglected if we're uplifting the loudest and the biggest. And then third, I have treating the crisis as singular. And that's something that historically, the climate environment being white, wealthy, and older has tend to do because they don't understand the different ways that these issues intersect, or they might not see them firsthand. So, you know, when we treat the crisis as if it exists in a vacuum, we're taught that things aren't related. So once again, to use Wilmington as an example, Wilmington has the most polluting sites in Los Angeles, but it also has like the second or third highest rate of gun violence. And to me, when I look at that, how can those things not be related, right? If you know, we have different forms of violence manifesting in similar ways. So when we think about how or what drives violence, a lot of it is interpersonal. A lot of it has to do with how you feel about your community, how you feel about the resources that are offered to you. You go outside and see 7 warehouses and a refinery. What does that mean for yourself? And how are you gonna look in, you know, when you look in the mirror, what are you gonna think of how people care about you? So I'm just gonna read an excerpt from a piece that I did about the connections about gun violence and pollution in Wilmington. So according to Southern California's air pollution regulator, Wilmington is home to 400 polluting sites. Wilmington is 8 square miles. But their locations are equally distributed. So in 13 of the city's 29 census blocks, there are just 8 industrial sites, and the other 16 census tract, there are nearly 370 industrial sites. And the census tract where there are only 8 industrial sites, there's been no instances of gun violence over the last 20 years. And the others, there's been close to 40 people who have been shot and killed. So like I said earlier, there are no coincidences, right? And that has everything to do with segregation by design. It has everything to do with poverty, access to education, and also access to the environment around you. So I spoke to one resident there while reporting that project that, you know, about the fact that like in the summertime when it's 90 degrees in LA, you're cooped up in your house, you don't feel comfortable walking outside because you literally cannot breathe, you're gonna be agitated, right? It's gonna increase mood swings, anger, all of those things, and then that leads to communal violence. And then we've had studies that have shown that, right? But that's just someone who is able to connect the dots using their own lived experience. The last failure I'll mention is something that even I struggle with often in this industry, is reporting on and not with. So I tend to think we should be reporting with the communities that we're writing about, right? Because the folks living through these issues hold the solutions, like I mentioned earlier. And this gets into like the fallacy of objectivity, right? And not bringing your whole self into your work. And for me, that would be impossible to do. And I've seen in the ways that by doing so, I've been able to connect with folks and to get into some more intricate issues of whatever environmental injustices they're facing. So I use one example from my time in Louisiana in March, when I was reporting on a story about hurricane recovery efforts in the aftermath of storms in 2020 and 2021. So in 2020 and 2021, Louisiana was hit by 5 major hurricanes and 6 tropical storms right at the peak of COVID. And I was able to connect with a woman in Lake Charles, Louisiana, which is right on the border of Louisiana and Texas, who has been in environmental justice movement for a long time, but has found herself separating from the traditional movement because she's seen big organizations like Greenpeace, which are, you know, majority white, coming into her community and not necessarily treating the voices of the people that live there as facts, right, or as something to base their work off of. But throughout our time together, she was able to see that I understood some of the more intricate aspects of what environmental injustice would do to a community. So we connected on the ways that, like, growing up, how oil infrastructure kind of dictated your worldview. So like as a kid, myself and others thought that clouds were made at refineries. So just like little things like that, where she also experienced that, allowed us to connect on a deeper level, which is so important to this work. Okay, so I kind of want to give just a brief definition of what I think environmental justice is. So ensuring communities have every resource they require to survive. And that looks different depending on the community you're in, right? So to use an example of Beaumont versus Wilmington, like in Wilmington, environmental justice, pedestrian transit safety looks like having bilingual street signs because it's a community that is 45% immigrant, 60% Spanish speaking, versus in Beaumont, it's literally just having street signs because it's a rural community that doesn't have those resources. At the end of the day, it's all about doing what makes the most sense to protect the folks that live there. I pulled out a quote from Sandy Saturn from a story I wrote about the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, which is based in the Bay Area of California. I think this kind of breaks down what environmental justice is and the intersections and the ways that it manifests for people on an everyday level, right? You might not necessarily be thinking about environmental regulations, pollution standards, but you are thinking about what a decrease in production means or an increase in oil production community means for your energy bill or your rents in terms of gentrification and things like that. So I thought this was a perfect quote. And I also wanted to highlight 4 big examples of what I think the expansion of environmental justice has looked like over the last couple of years. So first, I highlight APIN. Like I said, APIN is based in Richmond, California. They also do work in Oakland, and they're actually expanding to Wilmington this year, which is exciting. They were born out of the first environmental justice conference in the 1980s at the federal level. It was created following, a large number of immigrants moving into the area following the American bombing of the Vietnam House during the Vietnam War. And they've recently expanded to include different facets of justice organizing and their environmental justice work. So, that's looked like in 2020, they partnered with criminal justice orgs to move $10 million from the Richmond budget, or from the Richmond police budget, to different things like access to building affordable housing, access to affordable housing. They have also done things around tenants' rights and advocacy, in addition to homelessness and mental health. And one of the really cool things that they do a lot of youth programming at schools, and making the connection between the kind of ways that Chevron, which is located there, dictate daily life. So in Richmond, Chevron funds the community's only newspaper. They fund 10% of the police budget, and obviously then through taxes, they fund a lot of the municipal budget. And they also have worked to dictate housing rights. So they boxed out a lot of different properties in the community for workers and displaced longtime immigrant populations there. And through doing this, they've kind of built a racial solidarity between Black and Asian communities. So in Richmond, it's actually one of the first Black hubs in the Bay Area following the First World War. And over the years, Black population in the Bay has kind of been decimated by housing policies and racism and all those good things. But in the last couple of years, APIN has worked with the Black Lives Matter chapter there to not only do the work around police brutality and housing justice, but to also invite kind of a renaissance rebirth of the Black community there, which is really cool to see. Here we have Cop City, which I mentioned earlier. Cop City, which hasn't been built yet, but has been in the planning stage since 2019, is a 300-acre mock police training facility set to be built in the middle of Atlantis Forest, equipped with a full mock city, gun range, helicopter pads, military tanks. So really it's like a mock war zone in the middle of a neighborhood. And as folks may have seen over the last year, it's kind of entered the mainstream. A couple of months ago, a forest defender, so there's been a group of about 20 to 30 people who've taken up refuge in the forest in an attempt to block the development. A young man was killed by Atlanta police a couple of months ago. Atlanta police said he had a gun and that he shot first, and recently found out that none of that was true. But I think it's really cool because I think the fight around Chicago City is really cool because folks there have made those connections between police brutality and environmental justice, so the building of the facility was like a direct result of the uprisings in 2020 in Atlanta. The police foundation came out and said, by building this, it would help increase morale, it would help attract new police officers. Right after a cop had killed Rayshard Brooks in the city in June 2020. And folks quickly made the connection, that they don't want more police in the community, that's not what's going to make them safer. Rather than tearing down one of the most important green spaces, we'd rather see investment. I talked to one resident there who called very, very instinctively called this an active divestment rather than investment, even though they are introducing a $90 million project into the city. Sorry. Oh, and another point to bring out about this intersection is kind of to show that the mainstream environmental justice movement is falling behind in the times a bit. So after Tortuga's killing earlier this year, it took almost 3 weeks for the biggest environmental organizations to make a statement about what this means for the future of environmental protests and environmental justice, because it's a hot topic for older folks in terms of connecting those things and advocating for direct investment rather than police. The last one I wanted to highlight is the Chicago's teacher union. So if folks are not aware, in 2020, 2021, CTU went on one work stoppage and a strike advocating for stricter COVID policies. But what they did that now other school districts are starting to follow was kind of expand what organizing could look like, or labor organizing could look like. So these are some of their biggest pandemic demands, which were not taken as positively as by many residents in the city of Chicago, because there's a divisive relationship between CTU and the broader community. So folks don't know that Chicago's kind of the birthplace of American segregation, and it is still a very segregated city, even though it's 30% white, 30% black, and then 30% Latin. White and wealthy do not send their kids to Chicago public schools. The school system is only like 7 or 8% white. It is closer to 60% black, even though, like I said, only 30% of the city is black. So we know what that means in terms of investment and resources that are funneled into the school system. I thought it was really cool that they made an emphasis to bring climate justice into these demands, right? At a time when people were starting to make the connection between air pollution and like how it exacerbated COVID and changing temperatures and all of those things, to kind of make that very distinct demand was amazing and pushing for what labor organizing can look like. And we've seen now in LA, LAUSD is making some of those similar demands as they're going through a labor dispute. In addition, in 2020, they founded the Climate Justice Education Project, which, as we know, especially in things like Florida, over the last couple of years, access to education has been, or just education has been cut. We think of like, AP and courses that are being disrupted and things like that. And just personally for me, I thought that was really amazing, because like I took environmental science classes in high school, right? And my school was directly across the street from a refinery, but it was never mentioned in those courses. So by allowing students to kind of understand the ways that what they're learning interacts and intersects with their life, not that only does it make learning more exciting, but more useful for folks. I do have one more example. It's actually New York focused, the Cooper Park houses. So in Brooklyn, in Greenpoint, there's an extra property, Cooper Park, which is a majority Black public housing complex with an aging population. That is on top of two Superfund sites and next to a natural gas facility. And since 2019, the facility owned by National Grid has been trying to expand, because they say they have not been able to meet demand in terms of heating homes during the winter time. But as we've seen in New York, is trying to move away from using gas as a main energy source. Those two things don't really align. And residents there were able to make that connection. I thought it was really interesting because it is an aging population, right? And across the country, you don't usually see older folks continue to be in the fight, but also be like leading the expansive nature of it. And in Cooper Park, they've been able to connect housing justice to environmental justice. So, Greenpoint, the neighborhood directly surrounding Cooper Park at one point, I think it was like 2016, 2017, is the fastest gentrifying area in New York City. It's a majority white, wealthy area, just opposed to low income Black neighborhood that's kind of been had everything thrown at it over the last couple of decades. I think it's really poignant for where we are as a country, as retirement ages are being increased, that we are going to be fixing the housing crisis for older folks, and we're not going to be able to afford to stay where they've lived their whole lives. So to see people making that connection and fighting for their rights is really cool. And I have one quote from a woman who's been living at Cooper Park since the 1990s, is fearful with different things around NIEHS that she would be displaced soon, but has found herself, inspired enough to continue fighting. And then I just wanted to end this out on a case study using the more of the places that I call home. So on the left, we have Wilmington, on the right, Beaumont, Texas, which is wild to me because these photos kind of look like they could be from the same place, right? But like I said, they're 2,000 miles apart, and my family's been long gone from Beaumont, but it's kind of like in a way that I grew up there. But I wanted to highlight these places because I think one of the beautiful things about the environmental justice movement is that it manifests differently in communities, right? And that communities have different wants, needs, desires, visions for justice and equity. But at the end of the day, everybody wants the same things in terms of having clean air, water, and access to healthy food and whatnot. Stay there. Yeah, so for some more details about Wilmington, like I said, it's a 50% immigrant community, 60% Spanish speaking, it's 90% Latinx. Obviously low income community, one of the poorest in the city, and it's also a place where people don't have access to education. So less than half of adults have a high school diploma, less than 10% of adults have a college degree. And on the flip side, my father's hometown is majority Black. Residents do struggle with a lot of the same things like access to education. And actually the first Black high school, which was located in the neighborhood that this photo was taken, was bought out by ExxonMobil in 1990 and demolished and turned into a parking lot. So those things do manifest similarly, but it doesn't mean that folks are asking for the same thing, right? So we can call it racial dynamics, culture, history. So in Wilmington, there's not as much of an emphasis on maintaining the community, because a lot of folks, quite frankly, are worried about, their family back in, the countries that they came from, how to support them. Versus Beaumont, where people have lived, on the same tract of land for 100 years. There's this sense of camaraderie that does not depend on the industry there, and a desire for people to want to be able to stay in place, which in Wilmington is a desire to eat. So I just included some quotes from stories that I've written both about Wilmington and Beaumont. Kind of show how those intersections manifest differently. So I included one quote that I've already mentioned about, thinking clouds are born from refineries. Another quote, to be able to walk to and from school, something very simple, but when we think about what that means, that's like access to public transit, investing in infrastructure, making sure places have sidewalks, bike lanes, and that you do not have to cross, an idle train to get to school. And then lastly, a quote from a mother who lost her son to gun violence in 2020. Simply wants her son back, and like I mentioned earlier, that's an environment switch in terms of how safe you are in your community. And for Beaumont, we have another quote about education in terms of the school that I mentioned. That was demolished in the 1990s and turned into a parking lot. They have some folks who want ExxonMobil to continue to expand so they can get a check to move further in and away from the plant, but remaining in Beaumont. We've seen how, with that expansion, folks have lost like communal relationships and interactions. So one woman talked about the refinery building out over the home of her childhood best friend, and what happens to watch her leave the community, and what that meant for her growing up. And then just the different ways that people interact with the environment and nature around them. So, now people in Beaumont can't go crabbing and fishing in the river that cuts through the city because the refinery has built up along it, and the waterways are contaminated. Yeah. I think that is it.
Close out. We've had a lot of questions coming up in the chat, by the way, for everybody online, so. Another conversation.
I'll start with the first one, and have alternative facts, opinions, news, journalistic initiatives sprouted as a reaction to the failures of the mainstream journalism. Yeah, I mean, in my current job at Capital B, we're born out of the racial reckoning of 2020, whatever you want to call that, if it actually happened. But we're an all-Black publication that reports on Black communities throughout the US, and that's something that wouldn't have existed, especially in a nonprofit model a couple of years ago. So while there are a lot of folks within the industry kind of pushing back against the inequities that are enforced by the work that we do, there has been change, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that now as journalists, like we can kind of create our own persona, our own identity outside of our newsrooms, whether that be through Twitter, which is now dying, or Instagram, or things like that. Has the federal government served the environmental justice movement? 100%, I would say. I mean, like when we're looking at the Biden administration over the last 2 years, elevating environmental justice office. We now have 2 Black women leading, the most influential environmental policy council at the federal level. We've had billions of dollars invested in cleaning up our air, limiting pollution, and like I mentioned earlier, solving the water crisis. But the issue is that it takes a long time for these solutions to take root. So, as someone who is facing the impacts every day, you have to reconcile with the fact that it might be 10, 15, 20 years before you actually see a true change in your community. And as you're living through, all of that, what does that mean for your health? Like, are you kind of be here to see it happen?
Thank you so much for that talk. It was, I really enjoyed hearing about your life journey, but also your perspectives on kind of how the EJ movement is slowly expanding and your vision for that. So I really appreciate that. You know, so we're a school of public health and in the environmental health sciences department. And, you know, we're at this crossroads where we're trying to strengthen and expand our training on EJ for future scientists and public health professionals. You know, do you have thoughts, suggestions on, you know, what you would like to see, you know, like students, like the times we're training, be informed or educated or trained on when it comes to thinking and acting on EJ and climate justice?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is like being embedded in the communities that you're doing research on or you're trying to communicate to. Was talking to Merlin earlier about like, I think right now the journalism industry is kind of the middleman between academic research and, you know, communicating that to everyday folks, but like things get lost in translation. Like I tend to consider myself a smart person, but I misinterpret things all the time, right? So giving folks the tools to be direct communicators is really important, and then that starts to being embedded in the community.
Can I ask a similar kind of related question? I'm wondering, so in all the coverage that you've done of the academic science, what are the things that we often, that we need to improve on from our end? Like when we're publishing work that's relevant for environmental justice or that's relevant for informing where federal monies go, are there consistent patterns that you see where you see, oh, these researchers are missing this piece, or they're not considering this, or they really need to improve here beyond, in addition to, you know, being embedded in the communities and communicating directly with impacted people?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen like over the last couple of years that research has made a pivot to kind of include a more intersectional approach to think about race, gender, and those things in a lot more critical ways. But because this is kind of contradictory to what I said before, but one of the important things I think is like reaching out in addition to journalists. So like I've had conversations with researchers about the work that they're doing, sometimes as they're doing it, but mainly in the aftermath to kind of hone in on what you think are the biggest takeaways. And you know, you are as the researcher, as the expert, like you have the, or you should be able to shape the narrative in a sense of like what you want folks to get out of it, but just being able to directly communicate with the other decision makers. Yeah. Who do you think is a bigger and imminent danger for the inner cities and especially marginalized communities of color? Police, prison, or militarized organized gangs? I would need an explanation, a further explanation on this question. What do you mean by militarized weaponized gangs? NIEHS.
Yeah, I mean, gang activity. I mean, in the even before.
I hear you. I don't know how to fix that.
So sorry, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
No, we can't hear you. Would somebody else online mind speaking briefly, just so we can make sure we can hear you online?
Hello, we can hear Giannis online, but you can't hear us.
No. Jeez,
I can hear you, but I mean, I'm speaking. You can see I'm speaking.
I can hear you, Giannis. I don't know why other people can't.
Oh, here we go. I just heard you, Steve. Here we go. Now we can hear you.
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's you know, gang violence. I mean, even before the George Floyd incident, up until then, gang violence is the biggest threat to communities of color. I mean, it claims tens of thousands of victims in the big cities in Chicago. I mean, it's notorious. And I was wondering, can we understand police brutality, but at the same time, can you address gang violence without increased police? That's, I think, the juggling we have to do in terms of environmental justice. And what do you think, how these two problems can be solved with one measure, or simultaneously? Let's put it that way. That's where my question is aiming at.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I don't think there's one solution to solving the gun violence crisis in the US, but first, I'd like to say, I mean, all the data shows since 1990, community violence has been on a decline, and gun violence has been on a decline. But, what a lot of these communities are asking for, and Atlanta and neighborhoods in Atlanta specifically, when you do invest 30% of your municipal budget into police, that takes away from some of the resources that might be able to decrease violence, right? So if you think violence is coming from, poverty, like crimes of carjackings, just regular like thieves or stealing, things like that, why not, invest in job resources? Or in Wilmington's case, in a place where folks don't have access to the outdoors, and how that relates to the way that people relate to each other, like you don't know your neighbor, and then maybe if you do get into an argument, it's gonna escalate a lot quicker, because you don't get to see each other. So that would mean making, or building out sidewalks. That would mean increasing parks. So there are a lot of ways to tackle this outside of increasing police, because typically policing is like a reactionary measure, right? So police come after a crime happened to solve it, which tends not to happen in the United States. They're not there as it's going on. So once again, it's like communities having to be the ones to support themselves, to keep each other safe and secure. So by splitting or setting off some of that to other resources, a lot of folks think that might make a change. And thank you for your question. The data source for the Cop City slide is a story that I wrote in 2022, which you can find at capitalbnews.org. The very long question. Yeah, that's the last question. Yeah. Any other questions here? Okay.
I kind of, first of all, this was a fabulous presentation, and for the record, I think your PowerPoint is just fine. I have a question about point of view. Because, a lot of this stuff is just intrinsically an outrage, and yet I think a lot of us through when we study stuff that's an outrage, have trouble figuring out the balance between having kind of a stronger point of view about it versus just doing the scientific research. And I imagine journalism is not the exact same problem, but you probably have that too. If you want to be an honest reporter, but this stuff is an outrage. Cop City stuff maybe my blood boil. It's sitting here. And so I was wondering just how you navigate that. I've always been interested in how people who have to write about terrible things navigate this balance.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the helpful things is that there are other people that are outraged, right? So it's not necessarily me inserting my own opinions into the piece, but rather uplifting, the experiences and then viewpoints of folks who are living through it. But yeah, that's something I've definitely struggled with, not as much at Capital B, because even though we don't advertise ourselves as being, left, right, or kind of leaning, anyone's gonna look at us just because we are a Black organization and expect something from us. So that's made the work a little bit easier in terms of they're going to consider being more righteous or justice oriented. But it's something that I think when journalists grapple with that, it has led to a lot of communities being right now. And it goes into that idea like the fallacy about objectivity, right? And separating yourself from the work. Because it is enraging. It is, it's, disheartening and all of those things, and it's okay to live in that, accept that, and share that forward.
Thank you so much. The presentation was amazing and enjoyed very much every day of it. And you made a very acute observation about academia that many times we are cleared or framed about observing rather than helping with the solutions. And I agree very much with that. I want to ask you, do you have any examples where your interactions with academia have been adopted side or where academia has helped with the solutions, and how we can get into that space?
Yeah, I mean, to kind of use how I first, met Yoshi and like the work that she was doing at USC and like that kind of environmental surveying. And on one end, like that is objective, right? You are just collecting people's opinions about things, but in the sense of how you're going to frame it, and even like making that decision to focus on XYZ community and XYZ issue is like, in its sense, like a political move, right? And in a sense, the uplifting whatever struggle that is. And then that kind of work has been really helpful for me. I've seen like, I'm trying to think of another specific example. Like even I just recently did a story about researchers at the University of Arizona have like a hurricane prediction model. And on one end, they use the model to literally just disseminate the fact that there's gonna be X, Y, and Z amount of hurricanes, but they've also attached to their work, ways that communities can get prepared, ways that municipalities can prepare for this upcoming hurricanes. So there's twofold like science and then the more kind of colloquial work on the back end.
Just building on this idea of impact, I'm sure you're also motivated I'm assuming you're motivated to change the things that you report
That
about.
is the big one, yeah.
Right, and I was wondering if you could speak to some examples of what you have found to be some of the most meaningful impacts of some of the reporting that you've done, or
Yeah.
how that has kind of played out in different scenarios.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of examples, and honestly, the most impactful to me was the reporting that I did on Wilmington with Yoshi's help. That didn't lead to any response from the local government, didn't change anything, but it gave community members tools and data to kind of, just make them feel like their experiences were real, and in fact, right, and there's data behind that. But on a like more kind of tangible level, I did reporting in 2021 about a federal policy that was actually instituted by Trump and then expanded by Biden that, at the height of the pandemic, cities were giving funds to house unhoused people in hotels to get them vaccinated, to give them masks and things like that. But because it was disseminated through FEMA and cities had like a poor relationship with navigating that process, a lot of people or a lot of cities did not go after that work. But I was able to, like, through public record, I found only 20 cities across the United States use the program at all. And after that reporting, we found at least 4 cities that did end up using that program because of the reporting. So in a way, I was able to help get some folks housed for a couple of months, which was meant a lot to me. But work like that is being done all the time. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I had a question. Like you had mentioned that sometimes, like within a space, there might be different groups, and some of them are older or like this. No. I guess I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like how you navigate the different like voices that are within the space and they're telling a story, and like how do you, I don't know, figure out how to make sure that you're like representing the different voices that are speaking, and like figure out what to highlight, what to prioritize, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, first, I don't think there's any wrong way to like experience something. So if you are, have somebody who's lived in the community for 60 years versus someone who's 20 years old, they're obviously gonna look at their neighborhood differently. But there's nothing wrong with that. Like I can use Wilmington as an example again. Like older folks in that community have lived through, when the refinery was, spewing out 2 to 3 times as much pollution as it is today. So they look at today as like, we're in a good space, right? Because the air is relatively cleaner, community relatively safer, but the folks who are, 20 and have lived through what we see every day now, that doesn't mean anything to them. And I think it's okay to highlight both of those because it is the reality of the situation. And by doing that and, allowing people to share space with each other and like that transformative period of like learning about, how your neighbors are feeling about, the world around you does then lead to a change. But we do live in a divisive world where folks don't get, are not able to share space as often and to navigate through that by themselves. Hope that answered your question now.
Oh, okay. Well, last question before they leave us out of here.
So I was wondering, so I'm a researcher here, and I was wondering how academia can be most useful to communities. So we ourselves, we conducted a study in South Bronx, where we document changes in traffic and air pollution due to transportation sources. And at the time, at least I paid a lot of attention to getting things published. That's what we do.
Yeah.
And that's actually where also the money comes from that allows us to do that. And I wonder, so you mentioned that might not be most important, that maybe the experience is more important than documenting or measuring things. And did I understand this correctly?
Yeah, I think there's a balance to it, but yeah, one of the most helpful things is like deciding how you want to disseminate that information, right? So that your only goal is to publish in an academic journal. No one in the community that's researching on is ever going to know that. But that's not to say that you shouldn't be publishing in academic journals, right? But it can be a two-pronged approach, really. You do that, and then you have folks on the ground who are passing out your research, which is another price tag, because printing and dissemination is an expensive task. But I think it's necessary because at the end of the day, there's a reason why you're doing the work. And if it's not reaching the folks that you wanted to, then
so it's got to be a combination.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.